I guess this microphone works now. Wow. Way more people than I thought there'd be. Awesome. How's everybody doing? Woo, good. All right. I'm supposed to make a couple announcements before we get started. I don't have a warm-up act. I'm really sorry. I tried to get like a stand-up comedian, but I'm going to have to do. They want me to tell you to turn off your cell phones. You can put them on vibrate. I don't give a shit. So I'm going to be doing this talk. I'm going to go about 50 minutes or so. Then I'm going to bring up Paul Ritchie. Where are you, Paul? Who's the CEO of Toys for Bob? I don't know. He owns it. And he was also the creative director. So I'm going to bring him up and he'll answer questions. So if you guys are thinking of questions during the talk, think of stuff for me, but also for Paul, because I'm sure he'd be very happy to get some questions. All right. So, thank you everybody for coming to my talk. Honestly, given that Notch is talking across the way, I wasn't expecting many people to come. You guys do know that Notch is talking across the way, right? Nobody's going to change their mind in the middle? All right. Yeah, Paul, do you want to? Okay. So the name of the talk is Reaching into the Toy Chest, a look into the design of Skylanders Spyro's Adventure. And what this is about, is that my heartbeat? No? Okay. It must be next door. So what it's about are just sort of the trials and tribulations that we encountered along the road to making Skylanders. But more than that, this is about the design lessons that we learned and the design principles that we were able to apply to make this game under the intense pressure that we were under. So to start with, how many people here in the audience have a Skylander or a kid who has a Skylander or... Okay, so most of you know what this is, so I'll go through this next part pretty quick. So what is Skylanders? Skylanders is a video game where players purchase real-world toys. They put them on the portal of power, and then they come to life in the game. It's magical. It's awesome. In addition to this super awesome technology, we've also got brains in the toys. So the toys remember things that you do. You can give them cute little nicknames. You can put hats on them. You can buy upgrades and stats. And this is important because the game is also multiplayer. You can go over to your friend's house and play with him. So because the Skylanders remember everything you do, they also function cross-platform. You can, if I have a Wii and Paul has a 360, which I don't think you do, Paul, but if that is the case and I want to go over to his house and really, show him how much more awesome my Chop Chop is than his, then I can do that even though he has the 360. So enough about what Skylanders is. I would like to briefly go into the story of how the game was made, and not for its own sake, but because it'll kind of illuminate the reasons behind the design decisions we made, or the constraints that we had. It all started back in 2007, and I know that's a long time ago, and it's probably really hard to remember, so I have some reminders. The iPhone 1 came out that year. Zynga and Farmville won't exist for 2 more years. Duke Nukem 3D still wasn't out. Vivendi merged with Activision and, as a result, got the Spyro license, which started Toys for Bob working on the path to the game that would become Skylanders, Spyro's Adventure. There were a lot of different early concepts for this. It started off as a much more traditional game experience. There's this idea of a sort of a gritty, realistic version. Tiny Spyro, where he was in the real world and he ran around on bookshelves and stuff like that. And forgive me, Paul, if I'm really butchering these concepts. You can come up and... even Origami Spyro. But Activision kept wanting to do more with it. They wanted to push the bar. And so Toys for Bob kept coming up with more and more imaginative ways to use the Spyro license and sort of push it forward. And toys was the way that they thought to do this. One of the original ideas was like little eggs that hatched little toy dragons that you could play with. Like, there was some cool stuff. And the idea that eventually won out was Spyro's Kingdom, which eventually became Skylanders, Spyro's Adventure. Now, this talk isn't about history. I went into that incredibly long history lesson because I wanted to explain the constraints behind the design of this game. So first off, there was a lot of retrofitting that needed to be done. Toys for Bob started working on this a long time ago. There were a ton of assets around that it would have been irresponsible of us not to use. So we had to come up with ways to design the game such that we could use this old content as much as possible. Further, we have no fucking idea what Skylander you have on the portal, or even what Skylanders you own. We sell some that come with the game, but, I mean, you'd be at the sandbox with your friend Timmy, and you leave it there, you know, or your cat runs off with it. Like, there's a lot of things that could happen to your toys. So we couldn't do anything that forced you to use one. We had no idea what your powers are. We have no idea what level you are. We have no idea what upgrades you've bought. So that was a big challenge in making a game that relied so heavily on these toys that you bring to life. And then finally, we ended up in this weird situation where we needed to design the enemies, the levels, and the heroes, the Skylanders, all at the same time. Now, anyone who's done this before, and I imagine everybody in this room has done this before, knows that this is probably a recipe for disaster. Most of the time, in order for you to design your enemies, you need to know what your heroes are going to do. In order for you to design your levels, you need to know what your enemies are going to do. And in order to design your enemies, you need to know what your heroes are going to do. You have this crazy scissors, paper, rock cycle that never ends. So how do you make that? How do you take that challenge and execute on it the way that Toys for Bob did? Well, to start off, Skylanders is a combat game, so we really focused on the elements of it that support the fantasy of a little fighting monster that you bring to life. And so most of what I'm going to be talking about, what we did in this talk, is in relation to combat. And I'll bring up a few things later, but if anybody has questions that don't relate to combat, we'll have time during the questions to cover that. So first off, the core design principle behind combat gameplay, I think in any game, but especially in Skylanders, was what I like to call the big question. Now, I always like to say that games are a dialogue between the designer and the gamer. The designer asks questions, the gamer answers questions using the things that he has at his disposal. So the big question when it comes to combat is, who do you want to attack next? A lot of time, and I'll get into kind of the smaller questions later, but a lot of times we as designers tend to focus on the little things that the enemies are doing, the scissors, paper, rock relationship. But without this larger context, it doesn't actually make that much of a difference. And I'll get into later how this, when I get into examples of what we did, this will make a little more sense. The way that we achieved this crazy feat of parallel design was through the power of archetypes. For hero design, enemy design, level design, we came up with these archetypical situations or powers or questions that they're asking you, so that when a level designer was designing a level, he didn't necessarily have to know exactly what the enemy was in order to come up with a good intensity ramp for the enemies that he would have. The same went for the enemy designers and the hero designers. So I'm going to start with enemy design because this is my favorite. And, you know, that way if I run out of time, I can just sort of whitewash over the rest of the presentation and we can have time for cake afterwards. So in the enemy design of Skylanders, we had 4 main archetypes of enemies. And I'm going to go into each one of these, but the 4 archetypes are near enemies, far enemies, swarmers, and heavies. Now this isn't anything new. Like pretty much every game uses this. If you go look at Halo, if you go look at Zelda, if you go look at BioShock, you know, games with combat tend to have these 4 types of enemies because they work. And when you put them together, they become greater than the sum of their individual parts. So I'll go into near enemies first. Near enemies are really simple. All they got to do is get close to you, play a big old wind-up pre-attack animation, attack you, and then play a big old cool-down post-attack animation. Now, you'll notice that all of the archetypes I'm talking about have this pre-attack and post-attack. The reason for this is that really obvious question that the enemy's asking you, how are you going to dodge me? And how are you going to attack me? It makes it very clear to the player what he's supposed to be doing. And that will inform which Skylanders he's switching to. It will inform the tactics that he's using. It makes everything sort of congeal together and make sense. So for each of these enemy archetypes, I'm going to go into the Skylanders enemy types we had. We had this little Cyclops guy with an axe. His behavior was that he would spin around like crazy, and you'd have to avoid him while he did that. And then when he'd stop, he would be vulnerable, and you can come in and attack him. We also had this guy with this big electricity pick, and he'd slam it into the ground, and you'd have to avoid that, but he'd get stuck in the ground, and you'd have to come get him. And we had these guys with spears that would do little flip forwards and hit you. Now, each of these each of these enemies is asking a slightly different question to the player. And the reason I'm pointing all this out is because even though we sorted the enemies into these archetypes, there's room for a large amount of variety within each of the archetypes. Another thing I'm going to do is just down in the lower right corner of these slides, I'm going to put enemies of these archetypes that come from other games. I'm not going to get into it too much, but if anybody has questions about it, you can ask me at the end. So how do near enemies change the big question? To start with, you want to take them out at range. That makes that makes your choice of powers that you're going to use against them important. It also provokes the player to move around the playfield. Because this guy is only dangerous when he's close to you, you now have a reason to move around. It's pretty simple. Also, this enemy is only a priority when he's close to you. This makes him kind of unique in terms of the archetypes we have. And for each of these archetypes, I want to talk a little bit about how we got variety into it, because one of the questions I get most often when I give this type of talk is, doesn't this approach lead to formulaic feeling gameplay? And the thing is it doesn't. I always like to say that game design is an art and a craft, right? It's just like carpentry. I wouldn't try to build a chair without understanding the forces and materials and things behind building a chair. What I'm talking about here is that aspect, not necessarily making it beautiful. The making it beautiful and making it varied and stuff is a huge part of this, but I think it follows the knowledge of the craft. So how do you get variety into the archetype? It's pretty easy with near enemies. Pretty much the only things you can change are their attack and their locomotion. A near enemy can be anything from a dude with a sword, to a kamikaze guy who runs up to you and explodes, to a wizard who has a enemy-based area of effect attack. There are lots of different ways that you can change up this attack. The only key here is that the damage occurs close to the enemy itself. The other thing you can do is change the enemy's locomotion. With near enemies, you can have anything from guys that run around, guys that teleport. You can even have guys that don't move, and they're still interesting. So whenever we make enemy setups, I always like to think of them in terms of the simplest possible setups, and then I like to talk about how they build on each other. So with near enemies, these are going to sound really obvious, but they'll get more interesting later on. So the easiest one is a one-on-one setup. This is not too interesting. You're not asking yourself, who do I want to attack first, because there's only one guy there. The thing is when you get two guys or guys coming out in waves, it's not that much more interesting. Near enemies, by themselves, are not very interesting, except in one case, when you use them as obstacles. So, for example, the little yellow crosses are let's say they're explodey barrels, right? When you get close to them, they blow up. Or if an enemy gets close to them, they blow up. They're near enemies that don't move, and the little red guy is a near enemy that does move. So if you put the obstacles behind the enemy, now the player can use the obstacles against the enemy. And if you put the obstacles around the player, now the player has to be careful of them while he's fighting the enemy. You can see how, even though they're both in the same archetype, they're still asking very different questions. And I'm pointing this out because as we get into the other archetypes, you'll see how combining them together makes the whole thing much more interesting. But when it comes to just near enemies, there's not a ton that you can do. So far enemies, this is where it gets very interesting. Far enemies are like super simple. They're just dudes that shoot at you, right? They have some sort of projectile that comes from you to them. But they're very interesting because, I'm just going to skip that slide. They're very interesting because environment matters when it comes to far enemies. When you have near enemies, since they can't attack you from far away, your environment doesn't matter at all. If you've got them up on a ledge, if you've got them behind cover, it's all the same as fighting on a flat plane. So adding in far enemies to a setup and mixing them with the other types means that all of a sudden your level design is going to start to matter. Also, and this is more applicable to a game like Skylanders that's for a young audience, but friendly fire makes the kids feel smart. If an enemy is throwing something at you and accidentally hits another enemy in front of him, well, now the player gets to feel like he did that on purpose. So for Skylanders, that was a thing that actually helped us out. So how do we get variety into the far enemies? The main way is the projectiles. It honestly doesn't matter how they move, and I'm playing fast and loose with it a bit here, but the most important thing is the projectile. The projectile is the entire question. In Skylanders, we had guys that had, and this is when I'll go back to the other slide if I can. There we go. We had guys that had grenades, right? You'd lob them, they'd sit in an area, they'd explode. We had the squidlers, which are the guys on the right-hand side, and they actually would fire out another enemy out of their cannon that would come and function as a near enemy. And the Blade Witch, who had like a boomerang attack. She would spin around and throw it at you. Each of these is asking a slightly different question, and when mixed with the other enemy archetypes, ends up being very interesting. So let me skip through here. So the basic archetypes for far enemies, obviously you have the one-on-one, and then you now have the opportunity to use cover. So basically anything you can put between a far enemy and the player makes that enemy a little more interesting. So you can now ramp up intensity using just the far enemies. And I'll get into the cover a little bit more later and how that works. You can also have guys that are moving around, and that actually is interesting because they can attack you while they're moving around, whereas with a near enemy, not so much. When this really gets interesting is when you mix the two together. So if you look at this example, we've got the near guys, which are the Cyclopses, and we've got a far guy in the distance. And what this guy does is he chucks rocks down at you. So depending on which Skylander you have options in this setup. You can go take out the guys that are close to you. You can run up those stairs in the background and take that guy out. Or, if you have a Ruptor, because he's a pimp, he can just fling some fireballs up there and take that guy out. So you can see how the mixture of these guys and the level design now all of a sudden is starting to make your choice of Skylander more interesting. Yeah, that's about all I'm going to say on that. Eruptor's a pimp. So swarmers are the next type I want to get into. Swarmers are really simple. You see these in tons of games. They can be near enemies or far enemies. The main thing that differentiates them is that they're fragile. They don't do a ton of damage. They have low hit points. They serve a function of being dangerous in groups or mixed with other archetypes. But by themselves, they're rarely the priority for you. And it's important to have these guys because I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'll back up. So the most common swarmer in Skylanders is the Chompy. You can see how they work. They're really tiny. They have giant mouths with teeth. Their silhouettes are so much different from other near enemies that they're very clearly asking the player a different question. So how do swarmers change the big question? Well, by themselves, a swarmer is not that interesting as far as the big question. Do I attack that swarmer or that swarmer? It doesn't really matter. I could probably just attack them all. But mixed in with nears and fars, they get very interesting. And you can kind of see it in the example I posted earlier with Eruptor. If you have a ranged guy, a far enemy, who's across a gap or up on a ledge, and he's shooting at you, and you have a whole bunch of swarmers in front of you, well, normally, you don't really care about the swarmers. Unless you have an attack that can take them out really easily, you might not go after them first. You might decide to prioritize the guy in the distance. But once you add terrain into the mix, now it's a little more interesting, right? So swarmers in general are not your priority, but having them in the setup is interesting because the circumstances and the player's choice of tactics and weaponry make them interesting in that regard. So how do you get variety into the archetype? Just like with nears or fars, you can change their attacks. You could change their locomotion. I didn't write that down for some reason. I'm lazy. But mainly the differentiators are the size of the enemy and the model, is the silhouette. And I'm going to harp on this a little bit also with the heavy enemies. But if your players can't tell the difference between the different archetypes, then you have no gameplay because the player's not understanding the question you're asking him. The most common swarmer setup archetype is to just have them all come at you crazy kamikaze style. And that is interesting once. So the lesson with swarmers is mix them in with other types. Another interesting thing that we do with swarmers, and every game does this is not something that I've invented, but you can have swarmer spawners, enemies that spawn these enemies. The Squiddler was one of those. I mentioned him later as a far enemy. We also have these plants that are static and don't move, and all they do is shoot out chompies. And what we usually try to do is place the spawner in an inconvenient place, throwing chompies into a convenient place. So now it's an interesting question. I can take these guys out very easily, or I can take the extra effort and go try to take this guy out first. I mean, you'll have to take him out eventually, otherwise there will always be chompies, but that's not so bad. Mixing near enemies and swarmers together is interesting even if the swarmers are near enemies, because now you have to make a choice between this group of little weenies and this one dude who might actually be able to do some damage to you. So you can see how even just varying the model and the hit points sort of turns it into a different archetype. It turns it into a different question that we're asking the player. Mixing far enemies and swarmers, also very interesting. Because normally in this grouping, you're going to go after the far enemy unless you have a way of taking out all the swarmers easily. Because he's more of a threat, right? But then again, if level design comes into it, if the far enemy is now across a gap and he's hard to get to, you're changing up how you're going to answer that big question. You're changing up who you're going to attack next, and that gets interesting. And then when you mix all three together, you get magic. In a lot of our reviews, people have said, it's fun and I don't know why. And I think this is why. Because when you have these enemies asking different questions in the context of the big question, and I'm going to say the word question a ton of times, so then it gets interesting. So now I'm going to bring up heavies, and you may be wondering why I didn't count heavies in the magic there. They are definitely part of the magic, but I thought they deserved their own sort of breakout part of the talk. So heavies are the opposite of swarmers. Like swarmers, they can be nears, they can be fars. The main difference is that they're big and thick and hardy. They do damage to you, they're hard to beat. When a heavy shows up, the heavy is your priority, unless, of course, there's level design circumstances to surround it. So some of the heavy enemies from Skylanders, you can see how the silhouettes of these guys are very different than the silhouettes of any of the other enemies we talked about. These guys are much thicker, much beefier. If you saw them in comparison to the other enemies, they're much taller. We wanted to make sure that when the player saw this, even if he didn't know what this person's attack was, he would know that something different has happened. His priorities have to change. So heavy enemies, how do they change the big question? The enemy becomes the priority, but just like with far enemies, environment matters for these guys. Because if you put a heavy guy that has, we used to love to do this in Ratchet and Clank. We would float a giant floating robot torso out over a moat, and he would just fire at you, right? And we put some dudes in front of it so that he's your biggest threat, but these guys in front of you are making it dangerous for you to approach him, or they're blocking your shots, or basically the way you have the encounter laid out and the way that you've laid out the environment matter for these guys more than they do for, say, near enemies or swarmers. So how do we get variety into the archetype? Again, attacks. I mentioned on the previous slide, although I didn't say it, that these guys aren't mini-bosses, but they kind of are too. The more impressive, the bigger, the better. What you're trying to do is shock and awe the player with these guys. You want to make sure that they are under no illusions that other guys are more dangerous. You also have a lot of freedom when it comes to their attacks and the models and their movement, because these guys, you just have more polys to work with, right? It makes sense from that angle, but Also, because the players have different expectations from these enemies, they can do anything from, we have a guy who locks in shields over his face and charges at you. We have another guy who has a giant anchor that he swings around. We have suits of armor that are, posed and rigid and then come to life all of a sudden. You can have fun with these. These are good. The key is make sure that however you're having fun with them, they are still giant and impressive, and make sure that they're asking that question. So I'm going to go over, this is pretty simple, but the most magical combination, in my opinion, is when you mix far enemies with heavies. Because depending on where you put the far enemy in the setup, you can ask so many interesting questions. You put the far enemy up on a ledge, and that's hard to get to. Well, now he's harrying you while you're fighting this guy. So even though the far enemy is lower priority, you might want to take him out first just to make the fight with the big guy less dangerous. It's the same if you put him across a gap. These are the two enemies that are most important for making the level design actually mean something. So mixing them together also results in magic. And I don't have another picture of a wizard for that, but just imagine that I do. So I mentioned earlier kind of the scissors, paper, rock back and forth with enemies, and that's what I'm going to talk about on this slide. Individual enemies ask individual questions of the players. See, I told you I'd be saying questions a lot. For example, if you have enemies that have shields, right, that have a vulnerability state and an invulnerability state, the question they're asking is, how do you damage me? When do you damage me? If you have guys that are throwing grenades, if the grenades have friendly fire like our grenades do, then those grenades are asking a question. How can you use me to go kill other guys? There's a relationship with the player that enemies have that I think, like every designer is instinctively familiar with. A lot of design talks talk about this as kind of a scissors, paper, rock. If the player has this power, you want to make sure that this enemy encourages him to use this power. And I think that's amazing. I think that's awesome. You should totally do that. But it only matters in the context of the big question. Most of the time when I see combat-related games that are in trouble, it's because they're focusing too much on the little questions that the enemies are asking and not enough on the big question. They may have too many enemies of one archetype. They may have very interesting questions, but the players always see them and know what to do because they're not in mixed company. The level designs aren't asking other questions. So, questions. The key here is that the little things that the enemies try to get you to do enrich the big question. They are more important in the context of who do I attack next. I'm going to try to cover all the rest of the stuff in the next 20 minutes. Let's see how I do. All right. Level design. So just like with enemy design, for level design, we had archetypes. And there were 3 basic setups that you can do with level design. And I know this sounds like I am vastly and uselessly simplifying, but bear with me here because I'll bring it around later. The 3 things you can do with level design. You can have fights on a flat plane. And again, this is level design for combat gameplay. You can have fights involving a gap, which is any kind of horizontal separator. And you can have fights that involve a ledge, which is any kind of vertical separator. Some examples of gaps that we used in Skylanders, for example, are lava gaps, right? Lava gaps can be crossed by fire characters, but by nobody else. So it asks the exact same question as just a horizontal spacer, except now it's giving you a reason to choose a different Skylander. The same with water gaps. They can be crossed by water or flying characters. Voids, nobody can go across these. We don't have jump in the game. And then cover, which is another type of gap, basically blocks ranged attacks that are shot straight ahead. It means that having different types of ranged attacks are now interesting and useful. Ledges, you can have literal ledges. So for example, like a balcony that someone's standing on and shooting at you. But this could also be, if you're making a true crime style game or a GTA, it could be a dude standing on a table. Really, it's just the fact that he is slightly less convenient to get to that makes it matter, and that the enemy can take advantage of it, right? So that he's a ranged guy or something like that. One of the things we also tried to do in Skylanders was to have these placeable ledges we could use, the towers. And the original design was that you could destroy them, but it kind of got fudged along the way. So if any of you are wondering why there are some enemies in the game that you just can't kill unless you switch to a guy with a lobbed enemy, it's not because we're trying to make you buy new toys. Well, not just because we're trying to make you buy more toys. It's because we ran out of time to make them destructible. So now I'm coming back to the question, why is this abstraction useful? I mean, it sounds sure, this is pretty obvious, but why is this useful? For one thing, when you know that the three things you can do are flat planes, gaps, and ledges, all of a sudden, you can use this idea as placeholders in your level design without necessarily knowing anything about what your heroes or your enemies are capable of. In our case, remember I mentioned that we were doing a lot of retrofitting. A lot of what we had to do was take a look at these levels that already existed. The mesh was already done, and figure out ways to make a satisfying combat intensity ramp within these levels. And we could say things like, well, we're going to have a swarmer set up here, then we're going to have swarmers plus near, then we're going to do swarmers and a gap. I don't know why we're doing that, because it's stupid, but you get the idea, right? So it means that without necessarily knowing the intimate details of all the rest of the design, you can still design levels. And we found this out the hard way because we kind of had to do that. The other reason that it's important is, coming back to this example with Eruptor, the fact that that ranged guy is standing up there on the ledge is what makes this setup interesting at all. If the ranged guy was just down on the ground, Eruptor could just, because he's a pimp, could just shoot out a huge flood of lava and take them all out. Thank you. I appreciate that. I worked hard on that. That took some photoshopping. So what I'm trying to get to here is, even though it seems like a very simple concept, just planning in terms of these incredibly abstract archetypes gives you a set of very powerful tools to design, even if you're bottlenecked by something else. So one more level design related tool we had that I'm not going to go over too much, but if anyone has questions about, we can ask later, was what we called non-combat gameplay. This came in really late in the design process. This was things like, it was basically puzzles, pushing blocks, solving lock-picking puzzles, redirecting light, basically everything that Zelda did 10 years ago. We didn't have them designed early, right? We designed them all late, and we had to retrofit them into levels. So because we knew that they would be there, we could say, this area is a placeholder for this type of design. We know it will take a bunch of space to do this, so here you go. It's a placeholder. This sort of thing, not as useful as knowing about gaps and ledges and all that, which is why I'm only bringing it up on this one slide, but it was another thing that we had to consider when we were retrofitting these levels. And I'll get into a little bit more later about how we did the retrofitting, at least for some of the levels, but first I want to talk about hero design and make sure I don't run out of time. So by hero design, I mean the player abilities. We had 32 different Skylander characters. Am I right? 32, or was it more than that eventually? That's a lot of fucking hero characters. In addition to being a massive implementation challenge, just can you imagine trying to design enemy setups or puzzle gameplay or traversal or anything for that many different, wildly different type of heroes? It's madness, right? So we had to come up with, you guessed it, archetypes for the heroes. And our 4 different archetypes, and I kind of cheated, I just bitched out a little bit by making the last one special, but I'll get into it. So the 4 archetypes were close range guys, like Chop Chop, who's a skull guy with a sword. Straight ahead attacks, Spyro shoots his fire straight ahead. There's no verticality to it. And indirect attacks, which can be anything from throwing a grenade, to throwing a safe full of money, to summoning skulls to rain down from the sky. We had 32 fucking characters. And then special. Now, I'll get into these a little more right here. So close range powers, they basically function like near enemies. The idea is they hurt people who are close up. We've got, go going back 1 second. One interesting thing to note is we had also decided that we would try to give the Skylanders multiple powers in different archetypes to make sure that every Skylander had 2 attacks that he could do, and then 1 extra interesting thing you could buy for them to do later. We wanted to make sure that in those things, we weren't being too redundant. There's no real, you don't feel as cool about buying another melee attack as you do, buying the ability to roll into a little ball and shoot around like a pinball, or the ability to, quick, I need an example. Somebody crazy. Oh, it's like you didn't make the game. They're all great. Like Eruptor, who is a pimp. Eruptor does a close range, sorry, Paul, does a close range player-based area of effect attack, but his other thing is he has an indirect lobbed attack. So by understanding these 4 archetypes, close range powers, the straight ahead powers. Did I just skip over an Eruptor pimp joke? I'm sorry. Everybody look, he has the hat on again. Straight ahead powers, just things that shoot straight out. Indirect powers. Oh yeah, we've got someone that shoots rainbows, for Christ's sake. Why didn't we think of that? And then the special powers, which are movement or status-based. This guy I have here, Wrecking Ball, who's my personal favorite because he's the cutest goddamn thing I've ever seen. He can roll up into a ball and shoot around like a pinball, but he also has a tongue he can spit out to hit guys. And then later on, when you upgrade him, he can pull them in and eat them. It's awesome. So I lumped them all into this category because one of the things that our Skylanders designers were really good at was coming up with crazy fucking off-the-wall cool things for them to do. But we still needed to have sort of a bucket to hold this. So mentally, I think I always put them here. So why are these useful? These are useful for the same reason as the other archetypes. You can use them as placeholders. We could have quotas for how many straight-ahead guys we needed. When we decided which characters were going to go in the starter pack, we wanted to make sure that there were a good, broad assortment of the 4 archetypes, right? We have Trigger Happy, who has a straight-ahead and a lobbed attack. We have Spyro, who has a special charge attack and a straight-ahead attack. And we've got, Gilgrunt, who has a straight-ahead attack and a special sort of knockback hose spray attack. So we made sure that all of these were very well represented in the starter set so that the players could get used to them and know how to solve the problems later on. Another good reason was balancing. We could make sure that Skylanders by themselves didn't have redundant abilities, like I mentioned earlier. Chop Chop has a sword. Giving Chop Chop a mace sucks, right? Why would you pay for that, right? And in this case, you have to pay for them. So we need to make them super cool. Honestly, we're not that evil. And the other reason is synergy. We could, don't frown at me. Synergy. We can make sure that the powers would work well together. We have a character called Boomer who has a lobbed attack where he can throw dynamite. And he has another attack where he pounds the ground and knocks them far away. So there's synergy there. You knock them a little further away from you, you can throw the dynamite at them. Basic, but interesting. Unfortunately, poor Boomer. He was the guy that there were tons of him left over. Poor Boomer. Retrofitting. Right. So one of the major reasons I mentioned at the beginning of the talk that we came up with these archetypes was so that we could go back into mesh that already existed and retrofit gameplay in. So this is an example of one of the levels. This level was designed. This level was called Stormy Stronghold. Was the final name for it, and it had originally been designed with a completely different set of enemies for a completely different purpose, for almost a completely different game. I mean, we did a lot of iterations on this. So what we would do is we had these top-down traces of some of the levels, and those of us who were working remotely could come up with a good intensity ramp and send it over and help, right? So this gave us a chance to help. But the people who were actually working on these levels were doing something similar, just sort of in real time. They might not have used these maps exactly. You get what I mean? So once I finished filling it in with tons of information, this is what it would look like. I'm going to go into a couple of them. But you see how, so we have this setup. I called it Ambush 1. It's supposed to be easy. The idea is you ambush the player. You make it hard. The player's trying to get to those controls so that he can stop a tornado, like you do. But all I knew was that in that area, I wanted 3 near enemies. I had no idea that they were going to be the elves with spears that I mentioned earlier, but I knew that I wanted the near enemies. Because I knew that I had these near enemies, and I knew what I had as far as the layout went, I knew that I could then take the next 2 setups and ramp them up and make them a little more interesting. In the case of setup 4 here, hopefully you guys can read this. I don't know if it's high-res enough. But we've got a near guy there and 3 swarmers. They're the little blue dots up at the top that jump in and attack you. So now we started you off with near guys. Now we have swarmers plus near. And then I have this other setup where 2 more near guys can join the fight if the player tries to run past them. So without knowing any details about the implementation of the enemies, without knowing not only what the Skylanders could conceivably do one day down the line when they actually got made, but not even knowing what Skylanders you would own, right? We're still able to design a level that ramps up in intensity just by knowing these different archetypes. And I feel really dumb that I didn't pick an example that didn't have gaps and ledges and shit in it. But imagine that they're there, because they were, I swear. All right, so in summary, archetypes are your friend. They're very cool. I had used them before, but never this much. And I think they were very successful in helping us meet our goals. Again, the enemy archetypes, we've got nears, fars, heavies, and swarmers. For the level archetypes, we've got planes, gaps, and ledges. And now I'm just reading off a slide. You guys can read this yourself. Hero power is close, straight, indirect, and special. Also, Eruptor is a pimp. So now I want to call up Paul, who I've been harassing throughout this talk, to do questions. Are we ready for questions with mics and stuff? Is there anything? Oh, yeah. If anybody has questions, please come up to the microphones that are stationed there, and hopefully we can answer them for you. You want to sit down? You bet. Can we get a mic for Paul? I think this is... Oh, it's live. There you go.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the president of Toys for Bob. Got a bunch of other Toys for Bobbers right here.
There you go.
And Mike came in, I don't know, I think about a year before we were finished, and did a tremendous job in helping us take a game that had tons of combat, tons of character powers, and really transforming it into something that was balanced, structured, and allowed us to iterate all the way through the end and just make it better and better. So thank you very much, by the way, for doing it.
Thank you. Much appreciated. How about you first?
Thank you. Well, I actually have 2 questions. I hope that's okay. First thing is, you guys did a tremendous job. My older son bought me the game for Christmas so that he and I could play it together. And it was great. He loved it. The first question has to do with balancing, where when my younger son wanted to play the game, he started with all the characters really leveled up. And as a game designer, I was like, whoa, that's, don't do that. But in practice, it was awesome. And it enabled my 5-year-old to totally dominate the game, and he loved it. So I just wanted to ask you if you had a philosophy in terms of dealing with that balance is question number 1. And the second question was, they bought the game before Christmas. And then after Christmas, Best Buy, Fry's, Walmart, Target, every brick-and-mortar store had none. And every time I called to see if they had any, I was obviously not the first person who would call. They didn't know when they were getting any in, and they expected they would sell out immediately. Which, congratulations. That's got to be the best of all possible scenarios. But the question is...
The best of all possible scenarios would be people buying toys.
That's the question is, was it really, was there a production malfunction, or was it just...
There was a success malfunction.
Okay, that's good.
Do you... why don't I handle the balance one, and then you can talk about the success malfunction.
Sure, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So the question was, did we have a philosophy when it came to balancing these Skylanders of widely different abilities? And we did, but for the most part, we were also just kind of willing to, if you paid good money for that toy, and you spent the time to go upgrade him, and you now have a relationship with him. You know, his brain has memories from your adventures together, right? As a kid, this is pretty powerful stuff, right? It's, I think, more important than game balance, we found, was that you can keep that. We want to protect that and treasure that. So as far as balancing goes, it was challenging. Like normally, right? You set up your checkpoints, you set up your difficulty, you know exactly how it's going to go. We were just sort of like, let's play test the shit out of this and make sure that nobody gets completely hosed by it. And then if they can blaze through it, well, more power to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think we had the conversation with our designers where at first they were very concerned about, well, they could have 20 characters. That's not fair. You know, we're used to sort of making sure that we control the difficulty curve throughout the experience. And just one of the premises was, oh, no, you don't. Sorry. You know, we're going to let the customer play the way they play with toys, which is with a great deal of freedom. And we just had to sort of cross our fingers and hope that that would be a fun experience when people were overpowered. And it was actually Mike's boss, whose son leveled up his characters all the way to the 10th level and played all the way through the game. And Carl said, well, was that fun? He's like, that was awesome. He loved doing that. So because we let you choose how you want to play, you can play with one character all the way through. You can go out and buy 20 if they're available. Sorry about that.
And if you think that's crazy, when Skylanders Giants come out, now you've got all your fully leveled up characters from the first game. It's going to get crazier in terms of balancing. So we're looking forward to that.
Yes, it is. In terms of the success malfunction, you know, this had to be a big success. It was a tremendously expensive, complicated, difficult thing to do, not only in software, but fundamentally Skylanders is about being in the toy business. And that's really where all of our success occurs. And when we were looking after we had a version of the game where you were wearing hats, we had a version where you had a glowing egg. But when we finally got around to the toys, what we realized was we could succeed in a place where we had no competition, which was in the world of toys. It's actually, as game developers, I hope you appreciate, it's much easier to make cool toys than it is to make a cool game. So, and thankfully we were ignorant of the limitations of making toys. So once we settled on that, we said, well, you know, how many of these are we going to sell? Because like in the old cartridge days, you have to order these months and months ahead of time, and if you're stuck with them, they were all going to fill our office. So we just, you know, set this like crazy number of millions. And yeah,
it was like 11 million toys was the first run or something like that?
Well, yeah. And it was like, well, if every kid in our age range in the United States buys one, we'll hit that. Okay, that's kind of an aggressive goal. But what we didn't know is kids aren't going to buy one. First of all, the man children are buying 30. And bless them, every one. And the kids, I knew this. I gave it to my neighbors on all sides who had little kids. And I started getting letters the next morning from them talking about their characters, and the parents were just like, "Thanks, Paul." We had that. and then like, okay, Paul, they're addicted and they're all gone. So can you please score some for us? So I became the neighborhood pusher. So we're struggling now to. I mean, this is also. A big part of this is dealing with overseas manufacturing and the fact that there's a boat involved.
And you have to make a 6-ton piece of metal or something like that in order to print more of these, and there are only 6 in existence in the entire world.
It's a really interesting,
it's crazy.
As a game player and a game designer, integrating into the normally difficult game development, this kind of very complicated and new and foreign toy development was a blast. But unfortunately, when we ran out, there was months where we have to get the factories going, get the boat coming over, and hopefully they're all arriving. Although my favorite quote, we just released, I think, 3 new toys a couple of days ago, was the headline was, 3 new Skylanders toys not available.
Yeah. So we've got 10 more minutes. We'll try to shoot through some more questions. How about you?
So first I want to say congratulations on making a game where I've seen a 7-year-old destroy a room full of hardcore gamer college students.
I wish I'd seen that.
But,
Thanks.
Yeah, we couldn't touch him at all. So I noticed also that the 3DS version of the game is completely different, which the only reason I know is because I bought it for Stealth Elf. So how did you handle also having a separate game with the same characters also made simultaneously? Yes.
That was tough. Vicarious Visions did the 3DS game, and I worked with them on that. And that was a completely separate mean, there wasn't like an iron curtain between the companies, but you guys were pretty much heads down on your own things, right?
Right. So we right from the start, well, that's not true. About a year and a half from when we finished, we got this big kick in the butt, extra time on our schedule and extra money to really raise the stakes on Skylanders. So one of the things we said is, well, okay, let's go everywhere with it. Let's go to, the web, let's go to the 3DS, let's go to mobile. But it became clear that as cool as the kind of dungeon crawl experience was, we couldn't really deliver that on the 3DS, nor did it really make sense for session time and screen size. And Vicarious Visions had done a lot of mobile work. So what we said is the thing that must remain true is the character of the toy. The person's going to invest money in this, time, personalize it, they're going to take it back to their room. And so when they go to their friend's house, you can't give them a completely different character. It has to have the name, the hat, something like the powers. But you can make a different experience so long as it's the character in that experience. And in fact, it's more valuable because hopefully then, if you fall in love with your character, you want to take them on sort of little adventures to the web world or little adventures to the 3DS. What we did is we just sort of created, the toy was the interface. Okay, this is the representation of the character in the toy memory or in the magic area. And make sure that you deliver on that.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Go ahead.
Yeah, first of all, like the others, congratulations on the success. As a parent myself, I know at Christmas we did buy the original one and the expansions and all or the extra characters. So.
Awesome,
yeah.
Awesome.
And also congratulations on really sort of getting across this toy video game divide, which I know people have been trying to do for a while. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about non-combat options. Is that something you're exploring more? I mean, the dollhouse, the little Farmville version, whatever. Is that something you're exploring, or are you going to stay pretty close to combat, and that's where you see the most options? So
as far as non-combat versus combat, I mean, the main thrust of this game is about cool battle monsters. So we wanted the non-combat for variety because we had a game that was combat wall to wall, and when you have everything turned up to 11, 11 becomes the new 5, right? So non-combat gameplay was our way of adding in some spice of life to it. Do you have anything else you want to say about that?
It turned out to be way more important, actually, than I thought. We had put so much energy into making characters that these differentiated monstrous heroes. But what we didn't really know was the kind of asymmetrical co-op play that was going to go on with either a kid with their younger brother or sister or a kid with their parent, and the way they trade off in roles. Some kids do the combat, some people do the non-combat parts, and then usually the littlest kid is the one who switches the toys on the portal.
Yeah.
So it's really cute to watch. But what we found that about 2 minutes, you wanted to sort of break combat by about 2 minutes. And also, you don't want them to get stuck, if at all possible. Make the non-combat unfailable. They can just sort of do it quickly or do it somewhat more slowly, but they need to be able to proceed. We wanted very much never to actually just block the player straight up.
Totally, yeah. Oh, right. So what Laird just said, Laird, everybody. What Laird said was we also did the Spyro universe, like the online web world, which is a place where you can spend some time with the Skylanders, and it's not all about just wall-to-wall battle. And that was in part driven by the fact that we were using Flash, and we couldn't use our crazy 3D models with all their flexibility. They had to have 8 directions that they could go, and they had to fit in a sprite sheet. So, but it opened up a ton of new opportunities for things you could do with your Skylanders that you couldn't do before.
Yeah, you also needed to slow down the combat a little bit to give the option for any sort of social interaction or remotely, when your adrenaline's pumping, you don't want to like customize your house.
So when I first saw Skylanders, my first thought was,
Cash
my
grab?
God, this is going to change the face of the toy industry and our society's relationship with toys forever. So I'm just curious if you could talk about like how the toy industry reacted to this and whether you have competitors going after the same sort of concepts or not.
Well, I know you were aiming to change the way that people relate to toys entirely, right?
So obviously there have been people who've been shooting at the interaction between toys and computers for a while, whether it's UV Fun Keys or there's just there's a variety of toys where you get a little code on the bottom of your sort of soft animal, but then you just fling your soft animal or put it back in the package so you can sell them on eBay. What we wanted to do was make it a much more ongoing back and forth relationship between you and the toy. And a lot of this is just my sort of deep in love of toys and the characters that they sort of developed in my head over the years and are still there. And how I wanted, and the whole team wanted, to bring magic of toy play and imaginative play out into the real world and project it into the computer world and then transit back and forth between them. So one of the reasons why in the next year's toys, we've got this feature where they begin to glow as they approach the portal without batteries. And they actually start feeling magical in the real world. That's something no one's ever done in toys. And it's not because they couldn't. It's just they're on sort of a different path that they've been on for 100 years, making plastic toys a certain way for certain audiences. When we've been selling games, you just sell them on the shelves, and maybe they get divvied up into different genres. But in the toy world, there is boys this age range are always on this aisle. Girls will never go there. Here's the accessories aisle. Here's the Legos aisle. And it was like walking onto Mars or something. So
didn't you have a meeting with a Target guy who was asked what are you going to do about the Skylanders issue or something like that?
Oh, actually, it was a friend does licensing for a major motion picture, and they were bringing in one of their new licenses, and he told me this, and I was gleeful that he was asked, as someone doing an entirely different license, how are you going to handle the Skylanders issue? But the way that we interfaced with the toy industry was with the president of Toys R Us went insane over the game. And we knew he liked it because he actually brought his wife back from the hotel. She never did anything as far as we could tell in his business, but he went back, brought her back, and from that moment on was one of our biggest supporters and was willing to sort of do anything with us. And unlike toys where you can sort of drop ship your software in the last week and sell a bunch, toy planning is done months and months in advance. And so people commit to buying toys actually in February for the Christmas holiday. But we were coming in hot, just like a video game, and they were able... Yes? Oh, sure.
So what do you say?
1 minute long.
1 minute left? Okay, so let's get one really quick question in. And then...
I hope it's quick. One of the things I think is most interesting about the game is the drop in, drop out, both from the co-op and just being able to switch whatever your character is. So 2 quick questions, you can just answer one of them.
the best
what was
one.
the QA process like that for the drop in, drop out?
Madness. Madness.
Or what was the biggest challenge of doing the co-op with a game like this?
The camera. I would say, would you guys agree with me? Getting the camera to not freak the fuck out, because we had two characters on one screen co-op is like the hardest thing you can possibly do as a game maker. If you ever design a game that has co-op in it, put fucking split screen in it. Oh, God.
Well, I don't know if I agree with that. For us, the hardest thing was arbitrating between valid and invalid toy situations. So, you can have 2 champions, you can have a magic item, you can't have 4 toys. And, initially when we were doing it, we were like, okay, there's that toy, and okay, here's these 2 toys. No, don't put on. And when we gave them to kids, they were just like, they would put everything on there and take them off. And the bottom line was we just went, uh-oh, we have to be a lot more thoughtful and careful about exactly how we deal with this. And the testament is that it doesn't look like anything's happening. It just looks like, oh, okay, I can put this there, and my kid can put this here, and we can take it off. But that was tremendously complicated. And the speed with which we acknowledge that a toy has been put on and a toy has been pulled off is something that we spent months on, too, because when we had a 2-second delay, the magic just vanished.
So thank you, everybody, for coming out. I really appreciate it.